thank you so much for joining us today. I'm hoping that you could just start by introducing yourself and explain a little bit about your background and what you're here to talk about.
Sure. Well, I'm a business consultant. I've worked with the Small Business Development Administration for almost 7 years now. We are funded by the SBA to help business owners grow, find financing, and optimize operational protocols in their business. How this relates to attorneys is over the past few years, I've been working with Speakeasy clients as well as some other clients to help maximize net profitability and kind of dial into where their time energy is spent. Operational protocols keeps coming up, and I use the word guardrails a lot to give clients kind of a sense of how to set up their practice for success as opposed to constantly chasing after fires. You could be the most brilliant legal mind in the world, but nobody taught you how to run a business. And those principles are the same, whether you're running a small business, medium, large firm, or even a restaurant, right? So we have to keep in mind that how we delegate tasks to employees is ultimately going to be the roadmap to how our firm succeeds.
That's something we definitely talk a lot about here, is the difference between being a business owner and an attorney. And when you're running your own firm, you're kind of wearing both of those hats at once. You know, you worked with a lot of attorneys and at different stages of growth, especially at our sister company, Speakeasy. And you're talking about, you know, those different hats and everything. I'm curious, when someone's looking to, you know, continue to grow their practice and they're doing well, but they're starting to feel stretched thin, what does that actually practically look like from your perspective?
Yeah, so there's a paradox, right? It's common in the legal profession that success often creates a capacity crisis, right? When a practice is doing well, the administrative and operational cost of growth can quickly outpace the attorney's ability to practice law. An example would be a solo practitioner making $200 to $500K in revenue at this stage. They're wearing all hats, like you said. They're the primary producer, the marketer, the administrator. They're winning those high-value cases, but after spending Sunday nights formatting briefs or chasing unpaid invoices.
Yeah. And, you know, at this stage, it's very rarely a lack of capability. I've been having conversations with people about how just the grit that it takes to get through law school requires you to kind of be a rock star in terms of what you can handle. But regardless of your level of capability, the amount of work that has to run through one person can still create some issues. You were mentioning, you know, finishing briefs and chasing down invoices, but specifically in terms of operations, where do you see those kinds of roadblocks and that stretching thin?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great way to put it, right? They do feel stretched. The hourly value is diluted by tasks that a $20 to $25 an hour assistant could handle, right? Every larger practice, even larger practices, those with revenues at like 500 to $1 million, can have the same problem. Sure, they have a team, but they experience what I'm going to talk about a lot is called founder bottleneck, right? It's in full effect. Every single decision from a client's minor question to buying a new copier requires approval. So they have a team, but they feel stretched because they're still having to micromanage and they have to address every little thing that comes up. And it can be worse for even larger firms that are doing like 1.52 million because even the multiple associates in a dedicated office, their overhead is just massive, right? And they may be hitting record revenues, but their net profitability just isn't moving. They can't get the line to budge. They feel stretched because they constantly have to feed that beast. They're managing high-level personnel issues and seeking the next big case just to cover their monthly nut.
When we're talking about delegation then, and how that becomes the release valve almost to, you know, chasing profitability. So when attorneys start thinking about delegation, there are a few common patterns that you've mentioned you tend to see early on. Where does the process of delegation usually start to break down?
Sure. So in advising attorneys on operational efficiency, I talk a lot about guardrails, right? Setting up a guardrail on the highway. Without that, your staff is just going to drive off a cliff and there goes your business, right? So we need to delegate administrative tasks and break down what I call the founder bottleneck phase, right? And this usually occurs when an attorney has successfully hired a team, but he's hesitant to relinquish control, right? This is my baby. This is the way it's done. It has to be done this way. Only I can do it, right? And that leads to several common failures, right? One is decision making, where the process stalls, even with the team in place, because every single decision, from minor client inquiries to office equipment purchases, as I mentioned, still require an attorney's personal approval, right? This effectively halts the momentum, right? They can't move, and it keeps the attorney trapped in this cycle of micromanagement, and they're not thinking about business development. The other is overwhelming system maintenance, where the additional workload required to track employee performance and maintain oversight, it leads to attorneys just feeling overwhelmed, overburdened. I have a client who calls it the everyday drudgery, right? So he wants to be in the courtroom. He wants to be fighting for the client. He loves going out there and securing those big case wins, but he's just bogged down with this everyday tasks, the minutia. And this may view the act of setting up operational practices as burdensome, right? It's a heavy load, it's a heavy yoke to carry. And just doing the work themselves goes back to business overload, because then they're like, oh, I'll just do it myself, because it's just out of pure frustration. Financial blind spots. This is a big one, right? This can occur especially when the net profitability fails to move, as I mentioned earlier, even though you're pulling in those big revenues. This is where the attorney becomes stretched, again, trying to manage high-level personnel issues while he's still trying to hunt down those larger cases to cover this massive overhead, rather than just focusing on the billable legal work.
Along that whole path and all these steps you've outlined, there is this idea that just delegating should be able to create relief. But for a lot of people, whether it's because they feel like they have to micromanage or they're not sure which things they can hand off, it tends to create more friction at first. Can you talk about why that happens?
Sure. So it's the irony of delegation, right? That it often increases your workload before it reduces it. In a law firm, this friction usually occurs when we talk about the founder bottleneck and just isolating it, right? Figuring out where that is, hanging up the ego, which is really hard for a lot of my clients to do. Where the attorney's personal involvement remains the primary engine of the business, even after he's already hired a team, even after we go through his payroll and he has paralegal, legal assistants, services answering phones for him. So there's all these support systems in place, and yet delegation fails when you give away the work and you keep the authority. Right. So I had a client who was having a problem with his lead funnel because the actual employee felt intimidated going to him to ask a question. Right. So, he wasn't getting the leads coming in correctly. And he went to the person. He's like, why is this not happening? Oh, I just didn't feel like this. And they got scared. Right. And that was kind of a culture that was set up in the office incorrectly from the beginning. The staff were not given the proper tools in the toolbox to execute the task properly. So if a paralegal or assistant still needs approval from the attorney for every little thing, every little minor client update, you haven't successfully delegated. You've just created a more complex way to do the same work.
Right. I mean, culture is such a big thing. And in delegation, I think that's something people probably don't think about at first. And whether it's culture or other things, you've mentioned that before issues arise in delegation, it's not about the resistance to delegation itself or the resistance to handing off work, but how that work is handled, how that work is handed off.
Sure.
Can you expand a little bit on that?
Sure. Right. So many attorneys feel that the additional workload to track employee performance and maintain oversight is more burdensome than simply just doing the tasks themselves, or assuming that, back to that culture conversation, that they already know how to do it. So all I need to do is just point my finger like a magic wand and wave at you, and you're just going to magically do it. Right. That's where the friction occurs. It's a lack of SOPs. When an attorney expects through osmosis how to do a task, right, without documented workflows explaining step by step, here's how you go from this point to this point to this point, or an if-then, like a flow chart. The attorney spends more time correcting errors or re-explaining or reiterating instructions that he could have just taken simply to just do the work himself.
We'll talk a little bit more about SOPs in particular in the future, but I know a huge part of this is that founder bottleneck. So we can start there. When you're working with a firm, how do you help them, an attorney, distinguish between work that really needs their attention and the work that doesn't.
Sure. So we do this all the time, right? It's kind of doing a CBA, right? You have to help the law firm distinguish a high value legal work exercise and delegatable administrative task. It's best to focus on identifying where the bottleneck is, isolating the point where the attorney's refusal to relinquish control halts the firm momentum. It'll come to a dead stop, right? I've had clients in the middle of huge cases stop because there's some sort of staffing issue or somebody fumbled the ball along a line, and then they get held up wondering how that happened, and then they get pulled down a rabbit hole. First, we want to calculate that CBA by examining the attorney's revenue generating potential. We do that by caseload, right? We'll look at different cases and where the profitability is coming from and, where his time is best spent. If a solo practitioner earns a higher hourly rate but spends Sunday nights someone else can complete the task at a lower hourly rate without compromising the legal outcome, then the attorney's attention is unnecessary.
Yeah, and I mean, formatting briefs keeps coming up because it's such a key example. But I'm curious if there are other particular kinds of tasks or even idea that everything has to run.
It's like I said, checking that ego at the door, genuinely explain how to prioritize tasks by evaluating them based on actions to improve time management and focus, right? So we have the do list, that's urgent, important, right? We have schedule, which is important, but not. So these kind of quadrants allow them to kind of think in their systematic. I even say make a chart, right? Or put a schedule in front of your laptop, right? Or have your assistant have a sticky note with a list of tasks to communicate, okay, this was done, I'm still waiting on this. And you're taking something that could take, hours of your day and encapsulate it into a 5 to 10 minute text or conversation.
Yeah, that's such a game changer, getting mired down by feeling like everything you encounter has to be something that you spend your full attention on, as opposed to setting things into quadrants and then working with tasks from a framework like that. So helpful. At what point do you start to see that, impact someone's day-to-day and the overall consistency of work?
Energy, right? I had an attorney once tell me, imagine your day is a bucket and it's filled with water. And every time someone talks to you, every email, every phone call, you take a ladle and you scoop out some of your bucket. He said to me, he goes, at the end of the day, how much water do you want to have left in your bucket? And I use that analogy all the time when I'm trying to drill through to clients, especially the ones when I ask about their goals and they don't tell me that they have revenue goals. They don't tell me they want more cases. They say, I want more time. I want time to spend with my family. I want time to be on my boat. I want time on the golf course. I want time on the tennis court. Whatever it is that you want to do, we're trying to make you more efficient so you can accomplish that, right? So instead of formatting briefs or manually chasing invoices, now they're delegating tasks over to administrative leads, and then they're just checking in. Right? So that check-in time is now shaving an hour and a half off of each day. So at the end of the week, they have all this time now to focus on the things they want, to build their business, to be with their family, to focus on next steps. Some of them are even planning for early retirement.
When delegation starts working really well, what's different? What changes specifically in how the work is structured or how it's communicated?
Yeah, I mean, you're kind of going from firefighter, right, chasing after success, to becoming a strategic leader. And the workload is no longer this giant monolith of tasks, right? It's now a systematic breakdown where you can chip away at each piece and find a way to navigate having your life. And you're coming in and you're checking in with your employees. They have it done. You're going through the checklist. Now that it's done, you can move on. So instead of chasing after and doing those things that are the drudgery, your primary administrative task is just checking in and then going to court and doing what you do best.
Yeah. It's funny when you say that because, I've spoken with lots of attorneys myself, and I know this deep concern around the idea that if they're not paying attention, things won't be done the right way. And you mentioned SOPs, and we've talked about founder bottleneck and eliminating some of that. How do you see firms moving past this idea of, if I'm not doing it, it won't be done right, and delegating without lowering their standards?
I had a client who was cycling through different administrative people every few months, but he kept the higher end people. And I actually asked this client, I said, can I just meet with your higher end people outside of talking to you just to get a better feel? And what was revealed to me without the attorney being present is that there was an intimidation, not purposefully, but these admin lower level tier people were so scared to even ask a question because they thought it would put their job in jeopardy. There were no clear SOPs, right? It was just kind of a blanket, kind of assumed thing through osmosis that they would just know these things. And what wound up happening when we really dug into it is that the higher end, even the paralegals who should have been focused on actual legal work, their day was getting bogged down by going back to the legal assistant and having to explain everything from A to Z. So then when it came time to call them to task onto why their job wasn't getting done efficiently, it's because they were taking time out of their day to kind of go back and train the legal assistant just how to answer phones, how to handle leads, how to do follow-ups, simple things. So it all goes back to the standard operating procedures and really establishing those and having them posted, and even in a manual, or even I told them, I said, just post it put it on the wallpaper, or just put a thumbtack right there by their desk so they can reference it.
It's so funny. I mean, a huge reason why this conversation is even happening between us today is because, I think many people have been there where they think, gosh, I really could use a hand. And then they try bringing someone in and it winds up just creating more work for them. And there's a fine line between the two things that you're talking about, making sure that you have clearly defined SOPs and then also defining outcomes. And I'm curious, between focusing on every step and defining outcomes, how do you hold that line, and what does doing those two things look like in practice?
Sure. So what we want to shoot for is business speed. We want to see a metric where their net profitability is going up, but also how efficient is the team at executing these tasks, right? When delegation works, the firm doesn't stall anymore, right? You're not held up on the everyday drudgery. Every minor decision no longer requires approval, so the attorney is now free to do more of what it is that they do. Team members have the authority, they have the tools in their toolbox, they have the latitude, they have the guardrails, right? So they're no longer, I had a client explaining to me the other day that in spite of being told to do things a certain way, the team member was executing things their way because they felt it was more efficient. But they didn't understand that by doing it that way, they were cutting corners and just creating more work for the attorney, right? So, it all goes back to that directive, right? If you can change the mindset from check with me before you send this to update me once this is sent according to the template, then you eliminate that need for them to cut corners because there's no other place for them to go. The guardrail's already in place. The attorney's daily schedule then begins to open up. It aligns with the Eisenhower matrix logic, right? You're now prioritizing things according to what's happening each day. I suggested to an attorney a number of months ago, in terms of going back to the communication component, that we're going to lay out every task that needs to be done with a deadline, and then we're going to have a 3-day check-in with the assistants and the paralegals. So in the beginning of the week, whether it's a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Tuesday, Thursday, we're going to check in, we're going to assign, and then midweek, we're going to find out how much of that is accomplished and then still what remains. And at the end of week, we're going to cross out everything that was accomplished, but yet where the delays were and what's on the horizon for the following week. That way, we are entering the next week with productivity, not scrambling like a hamster on a wheel trying to get to a destination because tasks are piling up and it'll eventually snowball and roll over, right? That includes, if you need someone to go through your IT issues, your HR management, your leasing, even billable hours, right? If you're just sending out invoices or asking clients to refill their retainers, that should be handled by your assistants or your firm administrator. Anything that involves the attorney should be truly billable hours or something that is a strategic decision. So in essence, the successful delegation leads to higher net profit growth, right? Because you're now retaining more of that money that's coming in from your cases, and you're able to use that to focus on the growth of your business as opposed to patching holes that are in the ship. And they no longer need to be hunting just to cover a massive monthly. Tell me that the most repetitive tasks are the ones that are like bogging them down. And I said, ironically, those are the ones that are easiest to delegate. We can start with billing and invoicing, right? I have so many clients who are chasing unpaid invoices and having to format briefs that could just be done by an assistant. And I actually ask, I said, well, how much time do you want to be spending on this stuff as opposed to just having somebody else do it? I was in a meeting just the other day with a client, and he realized that all of his billings could just be fixed as simply as putting a BCC to the accounting firm, and then all the invoices just would be sent to the proper place as opposed to him having to approve. So when we kind of look at it from that perspective, we want to knock those tasks out and then look at how much time that's going to open up for you, and then it's kind of a come to Jesus moment. You've now seen revelation, and you're like, wow, I understand now. Another one would be like the initial intake, right? Why not use a service or an assistant to filter through these leads? I tell my clients they should only be involved if the rainmaker has to be called in and you need to be going to court, or we need to be looking at something from a judge, or we need to be setting an appointment, or we need to be doing something to build the firm. Otherwise, the delegation task is going to eliminate all of that drudgery and all of that yoke that you're carrying.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting to hear you talk about this Eisenhower matrix in the middle of all of that, and identifying different things like what should you own, what shouldn't you own? And moreover, what is that thing like? What's the little grit of sand in your shoe that just keeps you distracted? And it might not even take that long, but it just happens so often and it pulls you off focus. Like if you can attack that right out of the gate, then you're probably going to find a pretty big win. So
it's also about growth, right? Because as you grow, the attorney has to evolve, right? You can't be in the same place and grow, right? So you need to evolve from being this technical instructor to a system auditor, and going from, doing the work, being the primary producer, wearing all those hats, as we said in the beginning, to being an instructor and just do it this way, or here's the manual, or go through this is the training. This necessitates the SOPs. They're so critical, right? And allowing your team to now work independently, not having to bother you with all those minutia tasks. And the firm then becomes process oriented, and we're focusing on guardrails and protocols, and they're now contained in a space, and they're doing what they need to be doing, and they're producing like a factory. It's just a systematic 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And the end result is the client can now focus on higher level tasks. They can focus on their trial work. They become more results oriented and more comfortable using language like, just update me once this is done according to the template. And it's as simple as that. You start to see revenue growth, not just in net profits, but the attorneys are now securing higher value cases because their energy is there. They have more in that bucket, right? They're able to spend the time going to networking events. I tell my clients all the time, if you have the opportunity to go out and do these things, you're going to secure leads. And I have one client who's killing it because he's now more efficient, and now he has time at the end of the day to go attend these events and pick up more cases. Attorneys at these events are meeting him and giving him referrals. But it's because he's now more efficient in his own practice that he has the bandwidth and energy to do that.
Sounds arguably more enjoyable too than chasing down cases.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. I guess, we've covered a lot of ground here, and my closing question, particularly because, you're working with Speakeasy. I know that you're very familiar with what we do at DocketWorks as well, where we're providing attorneys, licensed practicing lawyers who get it, some of the minutiae and these details that we're talking about. But beyond providing, really excellent talent, we also provide support during the onboarding process to help identify what kind of pieces they should be delegating and how do we set up SOPs around that, so that lawyers who might really want to do this but feel overburdened by the time already kind of get to have that taken off their plate as well. From your perspective as, somebody that's worked with so many small business owners, and a business owner yourself, can you speak a little bit to what having that support structure in place really changes the game, and why that part of the process is so important.
Sure. So, when your firm successfully optimizes operations, and specifically through delegating tasks and structuring real solid SOP systems, there's a give back that happens to the practice. It's a shift from revenue-driven exhaustion to profit-driven sustainability. And the most immediate return is this reclamation of the attorney's highest valued asset. And I speak to attorneys, it's their mental bandwidth, right? It's the mental energy. It's that ability. It's a very stressful occupation as it is. But when you're dealing with the stress of having to navigate the employee landscape and staying in step with all of your city, county, and state's hiring laws and paying people, and then people not doing what they're supposed to be doing, it can be stressful, right? So when you remove all of that administrative noise, as an attorney, you can now focus on the higher level strategic trial work. I hear this all the time. I mean, I love the fight. I have attorneys tell me I love being in the courtroom, but it's just that feeling of what's going on. I come back to the office and everything's in shambles. And then that high of coming in from that win, or even the actual financial reward of having that win, is now being spent on patching those holes in the boat, right? And it leads, when you have better SOPs, that leads to securing better high value cases because your energy is renewed, right? You're having higher margins. You're ensuring that the firm is growing in net profitability. When systems work, the firm is no longer chasing fires, right? It's not, dependent on your physical presence where you have to be locked and chained to that desk. Decisions no longer stall, and things no longer sit in an inbox where they're not being addressed. Your team members, they have in a way that makes you and your firm look amazing.
For firms that don't want to figure all of this out on their own, what does having the right support structure in place change about the process?
Yeah, so having a support structure, it would be, someone like me who is a coach, advisor, or even a firm administrator that's working at your firm to kind of make sure everything is running in accordance with the SOPs. It's a game changer, right? It's going to change the friction of growth. When you don't have support, you're going to spend a lot of time, re-explaining the same thing over and over again. I go back to my example of my client who said he feels like he's on a hamster wheel, and it's like Groundhog Day. You're just going through the same thing over. It's very frustrating. Your goal should be to empower your staff so that they can keep the factory running while you're not there. You don't want to be chained to the desk, right? You want to be out there doing what you do best. Making it rain, winning those cases, growing the firm, getting your name out there. Structure helps solve what I call the feeding the beast problem, right? Instead of you're going and hunting for any case just to cover this massive monthly nut, right? You can have an advisor or an admin team or different types of support systems in place to help track performance metrics, right? And looking at how your firm is performing, not only on the cases that you're winning, but what are your costs and what's going out and how much are you spending on labor, right? What are the most profitable cases? What require most of your energy? What requires least of your energy? How can we structure it so people are handling multiple tasks so you don't have to be weighed down with so much staff that everybody is assigned a task list according to their abilities? The attorney can then make these data-driven decisions about where their practice is actually profitable and capitalize on it.
At the end of the day, that's a big, important part of what we're doing here. Of course, attorneys spend a lot of time trying to improve people's lives, and that is key. But if you can't keep the lights on while you're doing it, then, well, awesome. Thank you so much for taking some time today to share your insights with us. And for anybody who's been watching this, DocketWorks is a place where support structures are really the focus of what we do.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Taylor. I appreciate your time.